Imagine you are a European factory owner in 2022. You have spent decades building a clean energy business, navigating the notoriously strict rulebook of European state aid law, competing fair and square in an open market. Then one morning, your biggest customer calls and says they are moving production to the United States, because Washington just handed them a check worth hundreds of millions of dollars, no strings attached, no lengthy approval process, just a direct subsidy tied to building green technology on American soil. That phone call, in essence, is what the Inflation Reduction Act did to the transatlantic economic relationship. And to understand why it was so explosive, you have to understand something far deeper than just one piece of legislation. You have to understand how two of the world's most powerful economies have always held fundamentally different philosophies about the role of the state in shaping markets, and how history has repeatedly shown us that when those philosophies collide, the entire global economic order shifts. Let us start with the intellectual bedrock. In his landmark work, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith argued that markets, when left to their own devices, allocate resources more efficiently than any central planner could. This idea became the philosophical spine of what economists later called the Washington Consensus, a set of principles championed heavily in the 1980s and 1990s that emphasized free markets, open trade, and minimal government interference in private enterprise. The United States built much of its post-war economic foreign policy around this framework, consistently pressuring developing nations and trade partners to reduce subsidies and let the market decide winners and losers. Europe, on the other hand, was building something entirely different. The European project, born from the ashes of two world wars, was never purely about free markets. It was about controlled integration. The Treaty of Rome in 1957 embedded strict state aid rules directly into the architecture of the European Union precisely because the founding members had watched subsidies become weapons of economic nationalism. Countries had used government money to protect domestic industries, undercut competitors, and ultimately destabilize the entire continent. So Brussels constructed one of the most rigorous state aid regimes in the world, where any government money given to a private company had to be approved by the European Commission, justified on grounds of market failure, and designed to avoid distorting competition. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate constitutional constraint on how member states could use their fiscal power. Now here is where the tension becomes philosophically rich. The political scientist Karl Polanyi, in his extraordinary book The Great Transformation, warned that pure market liberalism is never truly self-sustaining. He argued that when markets are left completely unembedded from social and political institutions, societies push back, and governments inevitably intervene to protect their people. Polanyi called this the double movement. And what we saw with the IRA was essentially America's double movement, a recognition that decades of deindustrialization, of watching manufacturing leave American shores in the name of free trade and comparative advantage, had created political and economic vulnerabilities too dangerous to ignore. The historical parallel here is striking and important. Go back to the 1970s and early 1980s. The United States watched Japan's industrial policy, executed through its Ministry of International Trade and Industry, systematically build world-dominant positions in automobiles, semiconductors, and consumer electronics. Japan was not playing by Washington Consensus rules. It was picking winners, channeling state resources into strategic industries, and protecting them until they were globally competitive. The political scientist Chalmers Johnson documented this in detail in his 1982 book Mighty and the Japanese Miracle, arguing that the developmental state, not the free market, was the true engine of Japanese industrial success. The West largely dismissed this as an anomaly, a one-time phenomenon tied to post-war reconstruction. That was a mistake they would repeat with China decades later. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, the prevailing theory in Washington and Brussels was that integration into the global trading system would gradually liberalize China's economy and reduce its reliance on state-directed industrial policy. Instead, what happened confirmed everything Polanyi and Johnson had warned about. China's state-owned enterprises and massive government subsidies helped it capture dominant positions in solar panels, electric vehicles, and battery manufacturing at a speed that the open market West was structurally unable to match. By the time policymakers in Washington and Brussels fully absorbed what had happened, China controlled over 80% of global solar panel manufacturing and was rapidly consolidating its position in electric vehicle supply chains. This is the geopolitical context that made the Inflation Reduction Act not just an economic policy, but a civilizational response. Signed into law in August 2022, The IRA committed approximately $369 billion to clean energy investment, much of it delivered through direct tax credits and subsidies tied to domestic production requirements. The critical word there is domestic. Under the IRA's provisions, to qualify for the most generous incentives, companies had to manufacture in North America, source materials from North America, and hire American workers. This was industrial policy with an unapologetic nationalist core, and it was the United States, the very country that had spent 60 years lecturing the world about free markets and open trade, that was now deploying the most ambitious state-directed industrial strategy in its modern history. In the terminology of international trade law, this is what scholars call a localization requirement, and it sits in profound tension with World Trade Organization rules that the United States itself helped write. The economist Danny Roderick, whose work on the political trilemma of the world economy is essential reading for understanding this moment, has long argued that you cannot simultaneously have deep economic integration, national sovereignty over economic policy, and democratic governance. You can only ever have two of the three. What the IRA represented was America choosing national sovereignty and democratic governance, accepting that deep integration with the global trading system would have to give something. The European Union, having built its entire identity around deep integration, found itself holding the bag. The immediate European reaction was a mixture of fury and panic, and it was justified on multiple levels. European manufacturers began calculating that a German battery factory or a French solar panel producer could receive far more generous subsidies by relocating to the United States than by staying in Europe and fighting through the Commission's approval process. This is what economists call regulatory arbitrage, exploiting differences in rules between jurisdictions to gain competitive advantage. And because the EU's state aid framework was constitutionally designed to prevent exactly this kind of government generosity within the Union, Europe suddenly found itself in an asymmetric competition where its own rules were being used against it. To understand the depth of this problem, you have to appreciate what Robert Gilpin described in his seminal work The Political Economy of International Relations as hegemonic stability theory. The idea is that open international economic orders are maintained by a dominant power that sets and enforces the rules, because that dominant power benefits most from the system. When the hegemon decides the rules no longer serve its interests, the entire order becomes unstable. The Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971 precisely because the United States, facing the costs of the Vietnam War and mounting trade competition, abandoned the gold standard that the entire post-war monetary order was built upon. The IRA, in a parallel logic, signaled that the United States was no longer willing to sacrifice its industrial base on the altar of free trade theory, and every country that had structured its economy around the assumption of American rule following suddenly had to recalibrate. Europe's response unfolded in stages. Brussels temporarily relaxed its state aid rules through what it called the Temporary Crisis and Transition Framework, allowing member states to approve subsidies more quickly and with less scrutiny. Germany and France began deploying billions in national industrial support. The EU proposed its Net Zero Industry Act and Critical Raw Materials Act as structural responses. But here is the problem that commentators often overlook. Relaxing state aid rules within the EU does not solve the asymmetry. It potentially recreates the exact problem the state aid regime was designed to prevent. Wealthier member states like Germany and France have far larger fiscal capacity than smaller economies like Portugal or Romania. If every country starts subsidizing freely, you do not level the playing field with America. You fragment the single market along lines of national wealth. This is where the intellectual contribution of Mariana Mazzucato becomes deeply relevant. In her book The Entrepreneurial State, Mazzucato argues that the dichotomy between state and market is fundamentally false, that the most transformative technologies of the modern era, from the internet to the smartphone to GPS, were built on foundations of public investment. Her argument, now increasingly mainstream in Brussels, is that Europe does not need to choose between its regulatory tradition and industrial ambition. It needs to redesign the state aid framework to make mission-oriented investment possible without destroying the single market's coherence. The EU needs, in essence, a European IRA, but one designed for a union of 27 nations with different fiscal capacities, different industrial structures, and different political priorities. What this entire episode reveals, when you strip away the technical jargon and the political noise, is something that historians of economic thought have long understood. The global trading system has never been a neutral set of rules. It has always been a negotiated order reflecting the power, interests, and ideologies of its dominant players. When the United States was the unchallenged industrial power, free trade served American interests. When that power became contested, free trade became a vulnerability. Europe, having tied itself constitutionally to the free trade order, now faces the extraordinarily difficult task of adapting its rules without unraveling its identity. And the outcome of that adaptation will shape not just European competitiveness, but the architecture of the global economy for the next generation. If you found this analysis useful, drop a comment below and tell us which geopolitical shift you want us to cover next, because the world is moving fast and there is no shortage of history being made. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of it, because the ideas that explain this world do not make headlines, but they are exactly what shapes it.